but how does China make its economic decisions? What political and cultural concerns factor in? Joining us now is Jamie Metzl. He's Executive Vice President at the Asia Society and has worked at the White House, State Department, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Jamie, it is great to have you.
Thanks, Lori.
In reading your bio, you're quite an accomplished Ironman triathlete and a marathon runner. So what's more challenging these days, competing in these crazy races or analyzing these nuances of Chinese policy?
Well, the nuances of Chinese policy are just such a big deal. As much as I love my races, I mean, the story of China is really, in many ways, the story of our generation and how China develops, what kind of role China plays in the world economy and in world politics and in every aspect of global economy, society, governance, is going to determine in many ways how our world develops over the 21st century. So it's not accidental that everybody's focusing on these kinds of shifts and trying to best understand them.
Bottom line, is China going to be the world economic leader here before we know it?
China and the United States are going to have that role together. The United States is still a much larger economy than China, but China is advancing fast. And but China doesn't yet have the systems, it doesn't yet have the culture in place to prepare it to play the role that it's playing, and that's why we're seeing so much uncertainty.
So will the U.S. and China be able to work together in this future that you're depicting?
Well, they can. That's certainly one model, and I hope it happens. But there's an alternate future that's out there, which means in which we're not working as closely together. And if you look at issues now like currency, a big difference between what the United States and most of the international community would want and what China would want in politics, with Iran sanctions, with North Korea on climate change. China is finding its way, and that way is different from what the United States and other members of the international community would want.
Is it easy for us here in the U.S. to be so critical of China and say you're looking too inward, you need to look outward, because as you're describing, you're approaching world dominance or co-dominance, and you need to set a better example, therefore you have to quote-unquote play nicer with the world?
Well, it's not, I mean, certainly it's easy for us in that it's talk, but it's also essential for us because for the world to function, China needs to see itself as a stakeholder in the international system. And it may be a changed international system, but it needs to be a system that works for everybody. And right now, because of, and largely because of China's political culture, but also because of its culture, it's turning inward in a very interesting way, because the Chinese government and the Communist Party will be held accountable not by how it plays internationally, but by its people based on how it performs in economic growth. And because they don't have a base, a foundation in democratic legitimacy, they feel a lot of pressure to deliver the goods for the Chinese people, even if that happens at the expense of people elsewhere.
So what's going to change that paradigm? What's going to ultimately influence China to look more outward versus inward, as you're currently describing?
Well, there are two things. One is pressure from the outside. Right now, for example, on currency policy, everybody agrees that the Chinese currency is hugely undervalued, and that is significantly affecting exports from pretty much every place else in the world. So the countries of the world, when China was much smaller, people could say, well, they're not part of the system, but it's okay, who cares? Now, everybody has to care. So there's going to be increasingly more pressure on China to change its ways on currency, to play a more helpful role on issues like Iran, like North Korea, like climate change, because they're not going to get away with saying, oh, we're just a little developing country anymore. That's ridiculous.
What's the likelihood that the U.S. continues to place tariffs on its imports from China because China refuses to let the yuan appreciate to fair market values? And then there's, again, this backlash we've been discussing through this afternoon that, perhaps, China might stop buying U.S. treasuries, and that could send U.S. interest rates. I mean, it's really such a snowball effect, right?
It's a balance of terror between these two countries that are so interdependent right now. But my own personal view is that there has to be some revaluation of the yuan. But if America is acting alone, then that's not going to help. But the countries other than China need to get together, and maybe the G7 could be an appropriate forum for this, and say, here's what we would like to see from China, and here are all the things that we're going to do to welcome China to play the kind of role as an international stakeholder that we would like it to play. But if that doesn't happen, here are the steps that may be necessary to take. But everybody is a stakeholder in a peaceful rise where China sees itself as a stakeholder, as a country that wants to strengthen an international community that benefits everybody.
What's the worst case scenario, Jamie, for the U.S. if China holds on to its current policy?
Well, a trade war. That we may, I think a number of people are afraid that we've seen the high point of globalization, and that globalization is going to be receding. And if there is that kind of nationalist, every man, every country for itself approach, like we saw in the 18th century, like we saw in the 19th century, history has told us it doesn't work. If that's the model that we're going to have, we are entering into a very, very dangerous territory. I mean, these last 60 years has been what many have called this Pax Americana, this peace that existed within a structure. Now, if probably the second most important country in the world is not playing by those rules, someday we may get a better, more multilateral system, and that's great. But between now, the system that we have now, which is devolving, and that new system, which someday will be created, there's a really dangerous space, and that's the space we're entering now.
Is it unrealistic to expect China, with its booming economy, could come to the rescue of these Euro nations, even here in the U.S. to a certain degree?
Yeah. That is unrealistic.
With our crazy deficit problems.
Yeah.
So what's going on in Europe, it's completely isolated. There's no crossover connection.
There's a lot of crossover connection. And the United States, I mean, we are, whether one side is the drug dealer and one side is the drug user, I don't know who is who, but we have enormous problems. And if we can't address our issues of our debt, particularly, and really make our system work, then we're half of the problem, too.